Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever felt that agonizing friction of waiting on a giant stack of bureaucratic paperwork to get approved right when your project is demanding lightning fast agility? Yeah, we've all been there. Today, in this explainer, we're going to unpack a brilliant model that addresses this universal pain point. We're looking at that massive gap between traditional corporate red tape and the thrilling, dizzying speed of modern digital ecosystems. It's essentially a battle between the old way of doing things and the reality of how business actually operates today.
Right here is our core conflict. On one side, we have the paper system. You know the drill, it's the world of static documentation, it's entirely backward-looking, and it leans heavily on those rigid organizational charts. Now, contrast that with the other side, the living system. This is your modern digital environment. It operates on real-time behavior, it functions as a resilient network of value flows, and honestly, it operates right at the edge of chaos. The big problem here? Static paperwork completely fails when it tries to govern a lightning-fast, living digital environment.
Let's move to the agenda and see how this builds. First, we'll look at the static paper system. Second, the living digital ecosystem. Third, enter the boundary card, followed by the 5 non-negotiables. And finally, we'll wrap up with governance at the seams. Starting off with Section 1, the static paper system and traditional governance.
Traditional governance creates what we call the paper system. We all know it, those massive 3-ring binders sitting on a shelf, basically functioning as really expensive doorstops. Because it relies on static documentation and rigid organizational charts, it only tells you what happened yesterday. It constantly drifts away from the living system of actual digital behavior. Actually, scratch that. It doesn't just drift, it's completely divorced from reality. It's almost comical to think we can govern a globally distributed lightning-fast cloud network with a backward-looking manual that was obsolete the second it hit the printer.
Which brings us to Section 2, the living digital ecosystem, operating at the edge of chaos. In stark contrast, modern business is a living digital ecosystem, and it is a vibrant, incredibly chaotic web. Imagine these colorful, interconnected nodes. You've got your internal DevOps teams working at just breakneck speeds. They're constantly interacting with external cloud suppliers and dependencies. And woven throughout all of this are regulatory interfaces, monitoring statutory intent and operational behavior. This isn't a neat, top-down org chart. This is a dynamic, living organism where value streams flow continuously. It literally operates at the edge of chaos. If you try to impose a static paper process on this vibrant, moving target, the system is just going to route around it. Or worse, break entirely.
All right, Section 3, enter the boundary card and how we go about closing the gap.
So, what's the solution? It's called the boundary card. It's designed specifically to close that massive gap between the static paper and the living system. But I want to be absolutely clear here. This is not just another static form for someone to fill out and file away in a cabinet. No way. It's a dynamic tool. It acts as the vital connective tissue that embeds governance directly into the seams. Now you might be wondering, what exactly are the seams? The seams are those critical transition points within that chaotic web we just talked about. They are the exact places where value flows from one node to another, and consequently, where risk heavily concentrates. By placing the boundary card right at the seams, governance becomes a living, breathing part of the operation, not just an afterthought.
Let's move to Section 4, the 5 non-negotiables, or the rules of engagement.
The thing is, the boundary card isn't merely a suggestion. It's built on these 5 required steps: root outcomes, tolerances, decision rates, escalation triggers, and evidence expectations. So the crucial point is you can't just pick your favorites here. They work together as a cohesive, required package. When you embed all 5 of these into a seam, you create something incredibly powerful called bounded autonomy. Bounded autonomy means your teams have the freedom to move fast and make decisions, purely because the boundaries and rules of engagement are explicitly clear. Let's break down how this practically applies real quick. First, root outcomes. This is your strategic intent. It's simply defining what good looks like. Next, tolerances, your acceptable variance. Think of this like your speed limit, say specific latency caps. If you stay under the speed limit, you're good to go. Third, decision rights. This clearly identifies exactly who is authorized to pause, degrade, or recover a service in the heat of the moment. Fourth, escalation triggers. These are condition-based alerts that automatically move decisions to a higher authority if things get out of hand. And finally, evidence expectations, demanding operational proof drawn from real-time behavior and rehearsals, not just past promises. By defining these triggers and rights up front, Teams at the edge of chaos can act immediately. They don't have to wait for bureaucratic permission because, well, the permission is already engineered right into the seam.
And finally, Section 5, Governance at the Seams, and our ultimate takeaways. Making this work requires a massive mindset shift. We have to move from intent to operational proof, and this brilliantly illustrates the change. Traditional governance asks a passive, box-ticking question like, are we compliant? But governance at the seams asks an active, evidence-based question, can we recover? It uses real-time, evidence-based behavior to prove that the system works when things go wrong, rather than just pointing to a dusty document that says it should work in theory. So what does this all mean for us? These are the key findings you really need to take away. This framework fundamentally changes how you view control. You have to start visualizing your governance not as a top-down list of rules, but as a resilient network of value flows. You must move away from relying on rigid organizational charts that just don't reflect reality. You've got to make the transition from static paperwork to real-world resilience, and most importantly, you have to focus your operations and your governance directly at the seams, those critical intersections of risk and value. This empowers project managers, IT professionals, and executives to build genuinely resilient systems that can survive the edge of chaos rather than just surviving a paper audit. I want to leave you with this final, critical thought to evaluate your own systems. Look closely at your current operations and ask yourself, is your governance acting as a rigid organizational chart weighing you down, or is it a resilient network of value flows empowering you to move fast and stay safe? The edge of chaos is only terrifying if you're trying to govern it with paper. When you govern by assurance at the seams, that chaos literally becomes your greatest competitive advantage. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Now go find the seams in your own systems.